the system is to make sure that all the various components are checked out and operational before any modification is made to anything. So everything needs to be connected up in its normal Apple type configuration, and each of the individual elements need to be checked out, including the second disk drive to make sure it's operational, the internal disk drive to make sure it's operational, the mouse to make sure that it works and the programs load correctly, and the keyboard needs to be plugged in and checked out. The easiest way to do that is to select Mac right and then just type on the keyboard and make sure that it operates. Also, the modem should be checked out with Mac Term or some other communications program. Then once that's accomplished, then you're ready to do the dismantling of the system to modify it to a MacColby. Now, the first step is to get a piece of foam down on the work surface so that the various components that you're going to be working with don't get scratched. Set the Macintosh case down, face down, and using the two tools, the pry apart tool, which looks like this, and the special Torx screwdriver, which looks like this, which has a longer shaft than most easily obtained Torx screwdrivers. And there's 5 screws that need to be removed in the back. One of them is inside of the battery compartment cover. And 2 are inside of the recessed handle hold. It's a good idea to get a small jar or a plastic container to keep all the various screws and pieces that you're taking apart. Once the 5 screws are out, you take the pry apart tool and insert it into the joint between the 2 front and back pieces and gently pry it apart and move it around to the sides and then wiggle the top back piece until it comes off. Set that aside. Remove the RFI foil shield from the rear part. Unplug the yoke cable from the 2 PC boards. Set that aside. And using a standard Phillips screwdriver, remove the screw holding the logic board in after removing the logic to disk cable. Now, the logic board is static electricity sensitive, so be sure and set that aside on a conductive type plastic storage facility. Next step is to remove the ground wire Phillips screw that holds the green ground wire on, and then remove the Phillips head screw that holds the sweep power supply board in place. Then there's a power cable that goes to the CRT that needs to be unplugged from the sweep power supply board. Now this is probably the hardest part of the whole thing in removing the cable that goes to the CRT, the high voltage cable. You need to ground the standard flat blade screwdriver and very carefully slide it underneath the cap until contact is made with the metal clip that goes into the CRT. That discharges the high voltage that remains on the CRT. Then by squeezing the cap and pulling back the two little branches that go underneath the CRT high voltage connector, you can disconnect the CRT cable. Next step is just remove the power supply sweep board and set it aside. Then there's 4 screws holding the CRT in place that are removed. This is using this same Torx type screwdriver that we use to take the case apart. Now the CRT is very delicate and should be handled with care, because the rearmost part, the neck of the tube is very easily broken. So when it's internal disk drive, and that's accomplished by removing the 4 screws, these are Allen type screws that hold the disk drive bracket in place. The disk drive will be removed from its mounting bracket and then mounted in a new mounting bracket that's supplied with the MacColby unit kit. So the 3 screws that hold the disk drive into the Apple supplied mounting bracket are removed. And the bracket is set aside. If there's going to be a second disk drive installed on the MacColby, the outboard drive needs to be disassembled in a similar manner to the one that was on the inside of the machine. There's 4 Allen head screws in the bottom that need to be removed. There's 6 Allen head screws in the bottom that need to be removed. And then the cover taken off. The inside mechanism removed. The basic disk drive mechanism removed from the outer shell, and the power supply cable removed and set aside. That cable will no longer be needed. And that shield set aside and no longer used. The modem is removed from its plastic box by removing the 4 screws that hold the 2 halves of the box together. 2 of the screws are located under the 2 forwardmost stick-on rubber feet, which need to be peeled off. The other 2 screws are located about 3/4 of the way back. Now the modem board will be installed inside the MacColby, and there's only one modification that needs to be done, and that is to bend the light emitting diode, that's the off-on indicator, to a right angle from where it was normally mounted. And then when we mount it, we'll add some mounting spacer. The keyboard is removed from its plastic case by removing the screws on the Phillips screws on the bottom of the keyboard. The coiled so the 6 screws are simply removed, and the inside of the keyboard the MacColby unit, as it comes from the Colby factory, is partially together and requires the unit be stripped down to its bare chassis to be able to install the parts that were removed from the Macintosh. First step in taking the unit apart is to remove the carrying handle, which is secured by some screws on the inside of each of the 2 plastic covered areas. So a flat blade screwdriver is used to pry the push button off, and then a Allen screw is removed with an Allen wrench that is supplied with the unit in a small style wrench, and can be ordered as a more usable shop tool by ordering a Exolite uh, tool from any tool supply house, similar to this one. Once the two handles sides are removed, there's a holder, plastic holder that has two screws securing it that needs to be removed with that same Allen head screw type driver. The keyboard housing is simply snapped off of the top and set aside for the inside keyboard parts to be added to at a later time. The top keyboard retainer bar is simply snapped off, and then the unit can be set carefully on its face. And on the back, there's the Allen wrench that is normally supplied with the unit is pulled out. And then there's 3 thumb screws that need to be removed that will then release the rear panel so that the overall cover can be slid off. The screwdriver that is supplied with the unit, the Phillips screwdriver, is then used to remove the top cover hold-down screws, which are located on either side of the top. The screws holding the disk drive bracket in place, which is where the disk drives that were removed from the Apple components will be mounted, are removed, and the disk drive bracket is taken out. 2 disk drives will be mounted into that bracket, but first a shield that's supplied with the kit needs to be added to each of the 2 units, and those are simply screwed with 4 screws to the bottom of the disk drive. These are the 440 screws with the built-in lock washer, 1/4 inch long 440 screws with the built-in lock washer. The next step is to mount the two disk drives into the disk drive mounting bracket by using the same 440 by 1/4 inch screws with the built-in lock washers, 2 on each side of each drive. The completed assembly after the PC boards are mounted. If the modem is going to be installed, the volume control plastic shaft needs to be removed from one side and inserted into the other side. It's simply pulled out. It may require a pair of pliers to squeeze the end together, and it's just unplugged and essentially plugged into the other side. In the kit, there are some modem mounting plastic grommets that are inserted into the 4 holes in the corner of the PC board. These serve to stand the PC board of the modem off from the chassis. There's a little ring that holds the plastic grommet in place, which is removed from the outside of the grommet, and then after the grommet is in the hole, the plastic ring is pressed onto the body of the grommet, and then that holds the grommet in to the hole in the PC board. the main chassis of the MacColby holds all of the various components that were removed from the Apple Macintosh plastic boxes. The unit that's being removed right now is called the mouse house, and that will provide a place for the mouse to be carried, and the cable will be plugged into a connector mounted on the side of the mouse house. Four screws holding the mouse house into the chassis are removed, and the mouse house is slid temporarily out of the way. The modem is mounted on the rear panel of the chassis with a speaker at the bottom left-hand corner. In the MacColby kit, as part of the modem mounting equipment, and are inserted normally in the plastic grommets in the packing bag. The interconnect modular jack cable that's supplied in the MacColby kit is plugged into the bottommost modular jack on the modem board, routed around the fan, and plugged into the topmost modular jack on the rear PC board. The power cable for the modem is plugged onto the three-prong jack on the top of the modem board, routed across the top of the fan and plugged into the 3-pin jack that is directly above the modular jack where the modular cable was just plugged in the previous step. Then the modem 9-pin connection interconnect cable is plugged into the 9-pin plug onto the modem board, routed across the top of the fan, and plugged into the mating cable that terminates on the end of a ribbon cable, which is located right directly above the fan motor. The next step is to install the sweep video power supply board. First step in doing this is to add the new shield around the flyback transformer, which is supplied in a blue strip that is wrapped tightly around the transformer and then tied in place with the supplied tie wrap. The knob on the brightness control is removed and discarded, and a new extension tube with a knob on the end is inserted all the way onto the shaft up against the body of the brightness potentiometer. Next step is to mount the sweep power supply board. And this requires the removal of the screws on top of the little standoffs at the bottom of the chassis. The screw in the right rearmost corner is the hardest to put in and requires a self-holding screwdriver or a screwdriver that has the screw taped to the end of it. When installing the power supply sweep board, be sure and align the knob through the hole in the front panel before any of the screws are put in place. The screw in the rear corner needs to be attached to the screwdriver, which can be done by simply taping the screw to the end of the screwdriver and then inserting it through the two ground wires. The one ground wire being the wire from the Apple Sweep power supply board, the other ground wire being the ground from the Colby chassis. Both of these ground wires are put under the screw, and then the screw is inserted into the hole in the right bottom corner of the chassis and tightened up. Then the other screws are inserted through the power supply sweep board and tightened. The corner of the plastic insulator underneath the sweep board is folded out of the way so that the screw can be inserted into the hole in the PC board directly behind the brightness control. The next step is the installation of the CRT. Before the CRT is mounted, it needs to be cleaned with Windex or equivalent to remove the fingerprints, because the panel will be placed behind the anti-glare shield where it won't be accessible for cleaning. The rear of the anti-glare screen should be brushed to remove any dust or lint, because it likewise will not be accessible once the CRT is in place. Remove the screws on the rear of the 4 standoff spacers attached to the front panel. These will be placed through the ears on the perimeter of the tube to secure the CRT in place. When handling the CRT, use the utmost caution, protecting the rear neck of the tube from damage, as this is very easily broken. The rear left bottom screw is the most inaccessible, so that screw is done first. Simply place the screw into the tab on the edge of the tube. Set the whole assembly in place against the metal standoffs on the front panel. And tighten the screw with the Phillips screwdriver. After dropping the screw twice, you'll find an easy way to do it. Top right screw needs the ground wire that comes from the bundle of wires attached to the yoke put on before the screw is tightened down. This provides a ground path for any potential arcing from the CRT to the ground. The connector from the socket on the rearmost end of the tube is plugged into the sweep board, and also the white connector from the yoke of the tube is plugged into the power supply sweep board. Then the high voltage cap is inserted by peeling back the rubber covering and then having pushed together the two prongs by means of a small flat blade screwdriver. You simply insert the disk drive assembly is held in place with a screw on the right side of the unit, as well as 4 screws on the bottom. The screw on the right side, about halfway up the side of the chassis, and that one is inserted first and tightened. Then the 4 screws on the bottom of the disk drive bracket are inserted and tightened. Next step is the installation of the digital logic board. This is held in position with 3 screws, one of which requires a black or nylon insulating washer to be placed under the screw before installation of the screw. And that is the single screw that goes in the center of the board next to the end with the connectors. The other 2 mounting screws are in the opposite 2 corners. These do not require the insulating washer. The installation of the mouse house is started by plugging the mouse connector into the 9-pin connector in the side and the right side of the mouse house and tightening it down. The mouse house assembly is then inserted into the left side of the chassis, and the 4 screws holding the mouse house in place are inserted and tightened. Mouse house holds the mouse and the mouse cable for storage when the unit is being transported. The power cable from the digital logic board is inserted to the connector on the digital logic board with the prong side of the cable mounted connector going into the center part. The cable for the disk drives is inserted. There's a separate pin connector that is mounted to the cable assembly and inserted into the third hole on the top row, which is pin number 17. Third hole, the pin is inserted on the third hole on the bottom row. Mouse house connector is connected to the end 9-pin, and the 440 screws are inserted to hold the connectors in place. The keyboard cable is connected to the corner by simply inserting it into the modular jack connector. And the cables from the reset and programmers switches on the side are connected to the PC mounted switches by inserting the little socket onto the pins on top of the PC mounted black push button switches. The green ground wire is connected to the bracket on the digital logic board by means of a 632 by 1/4 inch screw. Notice that the lug goes on the inside of the bracket and the nut goes on top of the lug and is tightened down securely. The other end of the power cable plugs onto the center connector on the sweep video power supply board with the prongs on the cable mounted connector going toward the right. The audio cable is inserted into the PC-mounted audio jack, and the disk drive cables are oriented so that the pin 1, which is the red striped wire, is to the top left, and the cable that has the modified wires, which is the end of the cable, the connector at the end of the cable goes to the... Okay, we're going to install the 2 wires that go in parallel to the AC power switch on the chassis on the mother or the video sweep power supply board. And these are the 2 wires that have the blade type crimp-on connectors on the end of them. They're pulled through and latched onto the 2 metal legs that come out the rear of the PC-mounted power switch. Then a tie wrap is placed around so that the wires are held in position. Also, the power cable is tied to the rear of the mouse house, and the LED on the end of the modem board is connected via double-sided tape to the side of the chassis so that it holds it in place. Simply unplug the LED, put the double-sided tape between the chassis and the side of the LED, plug the LED back in. Then the fan blade needs to make sure that it is free rotating. It can be unplugged. The cable from the modem to the modular jack on the PC board can be tied via tie wrap so that the cable is out of the way of the fan. And then the fan blade reinstalled by pressing the fan blade with the metal ridge on it forward. Any other cables that are near the fan blade need to be tied off using plastic tie wraps to hold them out of the way of the rotating fan. There's some perforations where the air comes in the rear panel of the chassis where tie wraps can be looped through around the wires and then pulled securely together to hold the cables away from the fan blade. The end of the tie wrap can be then cut off with a cutter. The 2 wires that go to the rear of the AC power switch on the PC board need to be tied securely against the rear panel by putting a tie wrap around the wire, lacing the tie wrap through the air hole grill, and pulled securely against the rear panel. This keeps the power cables tied securely at an angle so they can't vibrate loose. Also, the fan power wires that go from the power connector in the center of the board to the fan can be tied down securely with a tie wrap. And then the ends of the tie wraps cut off. When reinstalling the fan blade, push the fan blade on with the metal end of the fan toward the front of the computer and push it until it's about 1/8 of an inch away from the body of the fan motor. Now we're ready for testing. Double check that all the connectors inside the machine are all connected, that all the wires are out of the way, that the fan rotates freely, that all scraps of wire and or pieces of tie wrap, tail, and miscellaneous screws and bolts are free, and plug the AC power into the PC mounted AC power receptacle and turn the power switch on the side of the computer on, at which point you should hear the familiar tone, as well as by turning the front mounted front mounted brightness control all the way up, you should see an image on the screen. The input, the inside connector, the inside adjustment for brightness should be done as follows. The front panel screen brightness control should be turned all the way down, all the way counterclockwise, and then the adjustment for brightness that is the potentiometer closest to the left-hand rear corner of the PC board should be turned clockwise until the image on the screen is barely visible. Once more, the front panel brightness control should be turned all the way down, all the way counterclockwise. Then the screwdriver adjust potentiometer under the mouth house. The rearmost left should be turned clockwise until the screen image is just barely visible. At this point, turn the front panel control up until normal brightness levels are attained on the screen. And then adjust the potentiometer toward the center of the board next to the brightness, which is the focus adjustment, until the best screen focus is achieved. At this point, the cover can be turned all the way over and attached, or if a Test is made of the disk drives. Both disk drives should be capable of reading the disk. Start with disk drive A, the top one, and that's what used to be the internal disk drive. Make sure that the drive is read correctly. Make sure it ejects correctly. Then test the bottom disk drive, which used to be the external disk drive. Make sure that it loads correctly, make sure it ejects correctly. Try the reset and interrupt buttons on the right side of the computer to make sure that they function normally. And now we're ready to put the unit together unless the video option board is to be installed. If that board is to be installed, turn the power off, disconnect the power cable, disconnect the power cable in the center of the sweep power supply board. Insert the video amplifier board. Be sure and insulate the top of the transformer to the left of the connector by sticking a rubber bumper on the top of that transformer. This is where the video board will rest on the left side. Then take the video board and take the video board and push it onto the PC mounted male connector. Then plug the power connector that was unplugged before directly on top of now we'll install the video output cable, the RCA phonotype cable, onto the PC board on the video amplifier, and the other end goes to the side connector PC board right below the audio connector. And then the audio connector needs to be replugged in. Okay, now we're ready to put the unit together. Put the top cover on. When the top cover is put in place, the little mating metal parts at the rear should have the lower tang below the top cover, and the outside flange should be outside on both sides of the top cover. Then the screws are inserted along with the flange on both sides and tightened. screwdriver mounts in a plastic clip along the right side of the computer, so as soon as the screws on the top are all tightened down, the screwdriver is mounted and the plastic cover is put over the top. To put the cover on, set the computer on its face, put the mouse in the mouse house, put the overall plastic cover down onto the unit. Push the wire from the mouse in to the opening and slide the sliding door closed to hold the wire in place. The rear panel needs the double-sided tape for the battery retainer installed. Which provides a means of keeping the battery from coming out of the battery holder. Then the rear panel, which is held in place with the 3 thumb screws, is installed and thumb screws tightened down. Then the AC power cable is plugged into the hole in the rear panel with the right angle tail going toward the right side of the computer. Power cable then can be wrapped around the legs with the U-ground plug end of the cable made to mate with one of the plastic legs to hold it in place. Then the Allen wrench is installed into the plastic holder that's behind the hole next to the upper right-hand corner. The next step is to install the handle, carrying handle, which is done by installing 2 plastic holders held in place with each with 2 screws. One on each side, both same identical part. and the side leg is put in place. Now, the side leg has two protrusions on the plastic that have to be mated correctly with the chassis mounted part, so that the two protrusions on the plastic piece attached to the handle side leg are inserted into the female part of the chassis mounted plastic. This provides the anti-rotation capability. The screw in the center of the handle is tightened so that the handle is free to move, but not super loose. The other handle with the carrying bar is first mated with the left-hand handle side leg, and then the same male-female plastic parts on the side leg and chassis need to be put together in a similar manner as the other side. Then the little plastic push button, install the spring-loaded push button by pushing it in till it snaps. Sometimes these buttons are hard to get in place and require them to be pushed side to side to get them to latch in correctly. Once they're in place, then jiggling the handle will cause them to pop out. To move the handle, both buttons must be depressed, and then the handle can be moved to any one of the locking positions. When it's put into the position desired, moving the handle back and forth will cause both buttons to pop, indicating that the handle is locked on both sides. The keyboard retainer bar is simply pressed into place by pushing onto the nylon snaps that hold it. The computer can then be set aside and the keyboard can be assembled. You'll need the PC board, keyboard part removed from the Apple case, the coil cord, and the Colby computer supplied case. The first step is to remove the screws around the perimeter of the bottom cover with a medium-sized Phillips screwdriver. Remove the bottom cover. Insert the keyboard, PC board after mounting the brackets on each end. These brackets are used to secure the keyboard to the frame. Make sure that the keyboard key set is centered into the hole in the cutout evenly from side to side and from top to bottom. Make sure that the keys on the perimeter of the keyboard are not hanging up on the metal cutout. Then, holding it in place, tighten up the screws that will then lock the keyboard in position. Double check, make sure that the keys are not hanging up on the edge of the metal of the opening and that the keyboard keys are centered into the opening in the keyboard cutout. Insert the modular jack plug into the modular jack on the PC board of the keyboard till it snaps. Then replace the screws around the perimeter of the keyboard holding the bottom cover in place on the keyboard frame. Then take the coil cord and plug it into the modular jack on the rear of the keyboard housing. And set the keyboard in place, set the computer up, turn the power on, and plug the keyboard into the right-hand keyboard connector. The other connectors can be tested with the printer after this initial test is done. Keyboard to carry the computer is simply snapped in position. And the keyboard cable can be disconnected and stored in the same mouse house space as the mouse cable. If the computer is going to have the accessory carrying bag, the bar has a padded Velcro rubber strip that needs to be installed. This keeps the handle from cutting into your hand when you're carrying it. Also protects the desktop when the handle is used as a tilt stand to hold the computer up. The optional carrying bag provides protection. It's a Cordura type waterproof, water-resistant type material that has a foam lining to keep the computer from being vibrated or scratched when carrying it in the trunk, carrying it on an airplane. The handle on the top can be used to carry the computer, or the optional fold-up handle can be used to carry it, or alternate between the two. The shoulder strap also provides an optional alternate way to carry the computer. The If the shoulder strap is used, the little fold-down handle can be used around there so that it can be carried on the side, some of the weight carried from that side-mounted handle, some of the weight on the shoulder.